I've just completed my transition from Pentax to Sony. If you're interested in how I compare Pentax and Sony, there is a video which I will put a link to on the screen, etc., where I do so, but I won't do it here. I started my transition to Sony using the A7RIII. I'm a believer that your secondary body as a photographer should not be identical to your primary body, that you are more versatile if it is complementary. And what I mean by complementary is, I believe it needs to have the same mount so that you can use the same lenses, but it should be orientated in a slightly different way. So when I bought the A7RIII, it was to replace my 24 megapixel APS-C Pentax K3, which had a higher frames per second rate, better reach, etc., than my primary body, which was a Pentax K1 full frame 36 megapixel body. So I had a lower resolution body with a higher frames per second rate and a higher resolution body with a slower frames per second rate. So for a while I used the Sony alongside the Pentax K1. Very happy with how the Sony performed, to the point that I decided that I waited until Pentax released the specs of their new APS-C body in case I wanted to go back. But I decided that's not for me. So then I decided I needed to replace my Pentax K1 with a complementary higher resolution body. So I was shooting with 36 megapixels. So I started looking around at which Sony body to replace it with. Now, one of the things I think Sony do really well from a consumer point of view is when they released the A7R4, they did not discontinue the A7R3. So the A7R4, if you're not familiar, has a 60 megapixel sensor. Its predecessor, the A7RIII, has a 42 megapixel sensor, both bigger than my Pentax. Now, I watched a lot of YouTube videos of the A7R3 versus the A7R4, with a lot of existing users saying it wasn't a good enough reason to upgrade, a lot of YouTubers saying stick with the A7R3, it's more bang for buck, 42 megapixels is more than most people need, etc., etc. So at first I was thinking about the fact that everybody's telling me I should just get the A7R3 and not the A7R4. So why did I end up picking up the A7R4 instead? Most YouTubers are not like me. When they are taking photographs, it is to share it on YouTube, to share it on social media. My intention when I take photographs is to print them. Now, when I look back at the last year, 2 years really, of studio photography for me, about 10% of all of my sold prints are 20 inches by 40 inches. That is significant, of significant size. And when I've sent those to my printer, to the lab, they have a traffic light system for what they consider going to get you the best results from your print. Now, PPI and DPI are not the same thing. PPI is pixels per inch, DPI is a printer term for how many dots per inch the printer places on the paper. But there were recommendations from the lab that I use. For a high quality print, they recommend 300 dots per inch, pixels per inch, sorry. For a good quality print, they recommend 250 plus PPI. They'll let you get away with 180. But they will likely use their own software to upscale anything you send them to 300 PPI. So I've always had to, if I've printed that size, even on the 36 megapixel K1, I've had to upscale my photos in Photoshop. I found that doing it myself gets a better result. And Photoshop has actually, apparently recently, although I've never tried it, massively improved the quality of upscaling as well. So that makes that easier. But when I did the maths, even with a 42 megapixel camera, I was still going to have to upscale if I wanted to print at 20 by 40 inches and hit the 300 PPI. I'll pop the maths on the screen for you. And that's ultimately the reason why I chose to go with the A7R4. I've been very happy with the choice so far, though it hasn't had a great deal of use. The autofocus is maybe not quite as brilliant as the A7RIII, but it's still a hell of a big leap from my Pentax days and more than sufficient. I won't use it all the time. I use it when I'm shooting with the intention of printing. I'll print in large. For example, I do a lot of headshot sessions, and the A7RIII will be used for that because it gives out a smaller file size, which is perfectly good for 10 by 8 prints, which is the print size that a headshot normally gets printed at, and for social media use, which is also how a headshot gets used. For that purpose, the A7R4 would be total overkill. But when I'm doing a session where I know the intention is to print something large, well, my intention is always when I'm selling prints that it's going to be large, then I prefer to use the highest megapixels that I can get away with, because that's going to reduce my time in the back end scaling images up in order to send them to print. It also means that when a client chooses to buy a digital image, they will get satisfactory print quality themselves without going through me. So that was purely my logic, and I think that is the number one reason to buy the A7R4 over the A7RIII if you're printing. Now, I know what you're going to say. There is lots of people online that tell you that people used to print billboards with 6 megapixel cameras. You don't need 60 megapixels, and that's true. That's true because of viewing distance. The closer you are to a picture, the better the print quality needs to be. A billboard, you never get up close to them. You drive by them in your car, you walk along the pavement, see them up on the side of buildings. However, large prints in galleries and on the wall of a home are different. My printer explained this to me, and I've observed it ever since over the years, and they are correct. I have prints on the walls in the studio here, and what people do is when they look at them, they walk right up to them and they look at the fine detail after having stood back and taken them in. And for that to stand up as best as it possibly can, the highest megapixel count you can get away with counts. Now, the low light performance is not going to be as good as the A7RIII, which is why I've got the A7RIII, but in the studio, most of the time I'm shooting at 100 ISO, sometimes even 50. So it's not really an issue for me. So if you're debating about whether you should buy an A7R3 or an A7R4, think about your own use. If you're going to be printing, and you expect to be printing large regularly, then I would say go for the A7R4. If you're going to be printing large occasionally, then watch 15 minutes in Photoshop upscaling a photo. It does a bloody good job. Save yourself the money, buy the A7R3 and spend the extra on glass if you've got the extra money. Anyway, thanks for listening, and I hope somebody out there found that helpful. Take care. Bye.